So it is just a little bit after noon. I'm going to go ahead and get us rolling. It's nice to see you all. I'm delighted to welcome back Lydia Brandt to our third and final, for now, installation of monuments on South Carolina State House grounds. We are able to do this thanks to support from South Carolina Humanities, as well as the Richland County Conservation Commission. And I know that I saw Nancy Stonecullum come on. So Nancy, thank you, and Richland County for your support of Lydia's work and our work in association with Lydia. Lydia Brandt joined the faculty at the School of Visual Art and Design at the University of South Carolina in 2011. She teaches the history of architecture, American art, and the theories and methods of historic preservation. She has published research on historic preservation and 20th century American architecture in literature, antiques and fine art, the public historian, and numerous books. University of Virginia Press published her first book, First in the Homes of His Countrymen, George Washington's Mount Vernon in the American Imagination, and that was in 2016. Her next book focuses on the antebellum plantation's image in popular American visual culture. Dr. Brandt is a dedicated advocate for local history and preservation, and I can speak to that both personally and professionally. When she came to the university in 2011, she looked us up first, and we've had a wonderful partnership over the years. She has also authored 3 National Register of Historic Places nominations in Columbia, so she's great in supporting preservation broadly throughout our community. And she's one of the 3 professors at the University of South Carolina who led the campaign for a monument to the university's first African-American professor, Richard Greener. That was in early 2018. And Christian Anderson is with us, and he was a partner in crime with Lydia on that effort. Dr. Brandt holds a BA in art history from New York University, after which she earned her MA in architectural history and her PhD in art and architectural history at the University of Virginia. The program that we are working on with Lydia is a lead up to a book that she is working on, a guidebook of the South Carolina State House grounds that University of South Carolina Press will publish next spring. So just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. You are all muted. If you have a question that you'd like to pose, please type it into the chat and I will read it, and we'll share it with Lydia once she concludes her presentation. We are, again, delighted to have you all. I will hand it over to Lydia.
Hi, how's everybody today? It's nice to see you all. Thank you so much for joining us. This is the third in this series of lectures. That was a really good opportunity for me to reconfigure the material that I put together for this guidebook. I'd never written a guidebook before, and in some ways it was great. It was easier to write than other things because you write the history of one monument and then you move on to the next one. But there wasn't much opportunity for me to see a kind of big picture. And so I really appreciated this opportunity to share some of my thoughts on this for you. It's helped me sort some things out. It's also fun to talk about these monuments and this landscape with a local audience, because there's some things that I can kind of assume that you know, and I don't always get to do that when I talk in other places. So this is been a fun series. So thank you, Robin and Chandler Yonkers, who really put this thing together, and also to my friend Kat Allen at Historic Columbia, who is another partner in crime and helps me out. So we began this series of talking about the history of the State House itself. And I argued that this building began in the 1850s, the current State House began in the 1850s as a temple to slavery and a temple to the belief that that white planter legislators had, that the Constitution defended their right to own other human beings. So part of it is about celebrating slavery and the economic possibilities and the social possibilities that they saw in slavery, opportunities. But also it's about pushing back against the federal government, who they saw as encroaching upon that right. We talked about how what happened after the Civil War when this building itself, as well as the ideas that it represented, were challenged. And I talked about how the building kind of acted as a trophy in many ways, both for the Republican legislature, the first biracial legislature in the history of South Carolina, and still the only majority Black state legislature in the history of the United States. This building really acted as a trophy for them. It was unfinished at the time of the Civil War. Sherman and the Union troops damaged the building, and then its first occupants was this biracial legislature. So they're not just taking the government back from the very people who enslaved them and oppressed them, but this black majority legislature was also the first to occupy the building. So this building that held tremendous power before the war is flipped on its head immediately after the war. I talked about what happened when South Carolinians took back power after Reconstruction, ending Reconstruction in 1876 with the election of Wade Hampton, the guy you see here. Wade Hampton was a Democrat, and he had also been a member of one of South Carolina's most powerful planter families, and he won in a fraudulent and violent election, upending that Republican majority and beginning to expel Republicans and African Americans from the state house. In the language of Hampton and his followers, they were redeemers. They were redeeming power, but they were also redeeming this place, and they were redeeming it for white people like themselves. They used monuments and the relationships between monuments to write this version of the past, the very recent past, onto the landscape. So I talked about how monuments like the equestrian statue to Wade Hampton commemorated both the Civil War as a loss, but also as a victory in terms of Reconstruction. So the statue is the body of Hampton, the Confederate general, and then the head of Hampton, the Reconstruction era governor. The monuments were placed in order to have relationships with each other, to reinforce these stories and to make connections across time. I talked about how even monuments like those to the Spanish American War and the Revolutionary War, like the Partisan Generals Monument you see here on the right, were all part of this attempt to reweave the story, recast the memory of South Carolina's history. So we're not just going back to the Civil War, we're going all the way back to the Revolutionary War and connecting it with Reconstruction. Together, as these monuments start to build, they form this landscape that reinforces this version of history. But it also legitimized what was happening in the present. And so we can move forward to 1940 with the erection of the Benjamin Tillman Monument, which brought these ideas of what was right, what was good, through all the way from the Revolutionary War up until the present. The erection of a monument to Ben Tillman connected the efforts that he and his supporters had to suppress and oppress Black people through the 1895 Constitution. It pushed back that to Reconstruction and even further to the Revolutionary War, legitimizing those contemporary ideas about segregation and Jim Crow and the oppression of Black voting rights that came with both. So the South Carolina State House grounds reinforce not only the history of the oppression of Black people in South Carolina by those white people in power, but also argued that this oppression could and should continue into the modern era. So we'll end our series today with a discussion of what happens to the site and this memory much more recently over the last 50 years. And you're going to get some brutalist buildings. I'm sorry if you're here for the monuments, but I have an opportunity to talk to you about brutalist buildings and tell you that these buildings are important. And I'm going to take it. I'm going to argue that although the state built new shiny buildings, and look how shiny they are, that concrete looks so smooth, all that limestone looks so good. Even though the state built these new shiny buildings and even some new monuments that represented a much more diverse population, and even in the case especially of the African American monument unveiled in 2001, a much more inclusive history, there were always compromises. The State House grounds does become more democratic over the last 50 years, but tensions are also brought more quickly to the surface. What we'll see is the transformation of a site that was built with one group in power to one in which that group is challenged, modified, and diluted. We'll also see the challenges of building monuments in this more democratic age. Design by committee is not a neat process, and all of the decisions that must go into making a monument are no longer universally accepted and must be hashed out by a greater group of people who might have goals that are completely divergent from one another and sometimes even competing. And as someone who worked on a monument campaign for a new monument for almost 10 years, and Christian, he's in the audience, Christian was my man with that. I know firsthand that in the end, most people aren't going to get what they want, and what you end up with isn't necessarily what you thought it would mean. So we're going to talk about how that process happens. The story of the recent history of the South Carolina State House grounds begins and ends with the Confederate monument. You might know where I'm going with this in terms of where it ends, but I hope that the beginning will be a little bit of surprise. The Confederate monument, as I've talked about in the last two lectures, was erected in 1879. So it was right after the redeemers of Wade Hampton and his Democratic friends took back the state house for white South Carolinians. It was originally located right up against the State House, but it was moved out in front of the building right on Gervais Street as a kind of exclamation point on the axis with the front of this powerful portico and this big dome that were finished about 20 years later, as a real statement of values and a statement that the lost cause and the redemption of Reconstruction was the story of South Carolina's 19th century past that those within the building were interested in and really believed in. But the mid-20th century history of the State House grounds has a lot to do with something that Columbians really like to complain about. I think all Americans really like to complain about that had to do with the State House, this Confederate monument, and that's parking. By the 1920s, cars were driving around the monument, and very quickly, people, especially legislators, began to turn it into a parking lot. By the 1960s, this parking lot around the Confederate monument had become embarrassing. There's newspaper editorials and legislators calling it a used car lot, a splattered, they comment about splattering gasoline and splattering oil. I would be worried. Up against the bottom of this Confederate monument that was that is so beautiful and that represents these lost cause ideals. Things got more embarrassing when Columbia comes on the national stage as a stop for presidential campaigns in the 1960s. Nixon comes in 1960 for the first time, and Johnson comes in 64. And as part of this kind of cleanup of Columbia in anticipation of television cameras and the candidates themselves, people start to talk a lot about this parking lot and worry that it shows our values that we would put a parking lot right up against this beautiful monument that represents all of these people who died for something that they believed in. By the mid-1960s, a committee of legislators forms and floats a plan for an elaborate fountain. And I apologize for the quality of this picture. This is definitely a cell phone picture taken in the archive. But if you can kind of zoom in and look closely, we're real glad this wasn't built. This is a giant Beaux-Art style series of fountains that would have replaced that parking lot with a very dramatic and formal landscape. You can see here's the Confederate monument here in the middle. Here at the back are the steps to the State House. There's little George Washington. Over here is the Spanish-American War monument, and then Tillman hangs out over here. So this would have really dramatized and changed the sound and the feel of the State House grounds. And so this is the idea that was floating around in the mid-1960s for how to deal with the parking lot problem. Before anybody could really get going on this, young Democratic Governor Robert McNair saw an opportunity. He could fix up the State House and grounds and build desperately new facilities all at once. See, the state government got bigger under Robert McNair than it had ever been, ever. A little kind of history in bureaucracy. And actually, my favorite monument on the State House grounds is a monument. I've never seen a monument like this. It is a monument to the bureaucracy that built the State House grounds. And you probably never noticed this monument, but it's fabulous. And on the back of it, it has little pictures of all the buildings that were built under Robert McNair, which I love a monument to buildings. That's great. A building is a monument. This is totally superfluous. But this gives you a sense of just what a big deal this was for McNair and how he took this kind of discussion over this parking lot surrounding the Confederate monument and blew it up into this huge project. So thanks in part to the fertilization of state government under President Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, South Carolina's government grew really big in the 1960s under McNair. So for the first time, we have agencies like parks and tourism. Expanding bureaucracy, the expanding bureaucracy was bigger than the legislators who didn't even want a state house in the new state house in the mid-19th century could have imagined. All of a sudden, in less than a decade, the South Carolina state government needed thousands of new square feet of office space, and more importantly, they needed parking spaces for thousands of new employees all around downtown Columbia. McNair really amazingly convinced his fiscally tight colleagues to stand behind him. And in less than 20 years, they dramatically changed the State House grounds and its landscape. In just 20 years, they make more changes at a greater scale than had happened in the 150 years that preceded them. The first task is to rearrange the State House grounds. And I want to thank Chandler Yonkers for making these maps for me. Because we had to reconstruct all of these paths as they looked in 1969 when McNair started this project based on aerial photographs. And that was some job. So thanks a lot, Chandler. It's really helpful to see a kind of before and after of what the State House grounds looked like before McNair hired landscape architect Robert Marvin to rearrange the State House grounds landscape. So I'm just talking about south or north of Senate Street, so just those blocks just around the State House. So Colleton County native Robert Marvin was probably the most important modernist landscape architect from South Carolina. And McNair came to him in 1967 with this rendering, this plan for this fountain, and said, all right, Mr. Marvin, you're the landscape architect here. You know what you're doing. This is what our legislature is talking about. What do you think? Well, Robert Marvin was very gracious, and he just turned around and he threw it in the trash can. And he started all over again. And so we end up with the landscape that if you've been on the State House grounds since 1972, this is the landscape that you have experienced. He cleaned up and regularized all of the paths. Most of them are still winding. They still have that kind of 19th century curved, picturesque feel that is true to the landscape as it was instituted in the 1870s. but it's much more organized. And if you look at the plan here on the bottom of the screen, it's really pretty symmetrical. He designed new hedges and plantings around the edge and arranged the paths so that you could do a big loop through a series of trees and really not see the streets on either side. So you can walk over here on these paths along Sumter Street. You might hear the traffic, but in many places you can't see it. He was also very respectful of existing trees, some of which were pretty scrubby. They just went out, but a lot of them were older. And so if you're ever over here on this corner by the gravestone of Lunsford, you can see that he actually took a path right around an existing magnolia tree. So he was interested in maintaining some of the historic trees, densifying, creating layers to the landscape, and really making a park that was inviting and not just a place where you might stop if you have to. He even chose a sidewalk aggregate, the kind of pebbly stuff that goes into concrete when laying a sidewalk. He chose an aggregate that would match the stone of the exterior of the State House. So he's really thinking about the details. He also moved 6 monuments, and so I've highlighted those here. 6 monuments to other places on the grounds. And so this is where the Hampton Monument was. That was moved back here in front of the Hampton building. He moves the Sims Monument, goes to this corner here. The Confederate Women's Monument goes back to the back of Pendleton Street, which I'll talk about in a minute. The gravestone for the first State House that burned down was actually moved, so it doesn't really mark the place that this first State House was anymore, which I think is awesome. And then this is the Palmetto Monument here, which takes that place. And then the Liberty Bell gets shoved back here, and that's why you've probably never noticed it. So these 6 monuments are moved to be symmetrical to each other and to the building. They're all turned to face inward to the building. And really, Marvin was thinking of them as kind of punctuation points or moments to create a kind of reflection point, place to stop and think, or gather trees, or create a kind of path, destination for a path. He's not necessarily thinking about those connections historically that were so important to those monuments. So for example, when the Hampton Monument is moved, that relationship that's so important with the Partisan Generals Monument, with the Tellman Monument, and with his grave over at Trinity Church, all of that is severed and lost. Most dramatically, he also moves all the monuments away from the building and raises up the level of the ground right up against the building, and then creates another path around it. So what this does is that it gives primacy to the building. The monuments are there kind of in decoration of the building, but they're not close to it. They're pushed away. And so that is a really important outcome of Robert Marvin's plan. The building is now kind of raised up on a podium, and it's emphasized. It sits on the highest point of the site, and this kind of this podium-like nature that he imagines helps to emphasize that. But McNair's ambitions stretched beyond the confines of just that State House lot. He wants to push the State House grounds further to include more buildings, more of that square footage, more parking spaces, so that he can really envision his new state government. So McNair hires the leading modernist landscape architecture firm in the state, Lyles, Bissett, Carlisle, and Wolfe, to design a master plan for the State House grounds. They call the Capitol Complex Plan. And they work really closely with the transportation planning firm that I've been doing a lot of research on lately, called Wilbur Smith and Associates, which was at the time one of the country's biggest transportation and planning firms. They were doing consultations on cities all around the world. And they're based here in Columbia. And McNair hires them to work together to come up with a comprehensive plan that will not only think through the Capitol's relationship with other buildings right next to it, but also new buildings, new landscapes beyond the traditional confines of the State House grounds. So there were a series of buildings, and I'm sure you're familiar with these buildings, down on Senate Street. So we have the Rutledge building is here, the State Library is here, and then the original State Archives, which is now a state office building, is here. And he imagined that these buildings, or LBC&W and Wilbur Smith and Associates, imagined that they could push the State House ground further along Senate Street, that they could also push it across Assembly Street as well as south of Pendleton Street, that they grab these existing buildings but also plan new buildings that, when all connected by pedestrian malls, would create this massive state capitol complex that would really attest to the power of state government in the late 20th century. So this is the plan. Here's what they actually do. They first close Senate Street to parking. This is something that most people have probably taken for granted, especially me that didn't know Columbia before 1969, when Senate Street was closed to parking. This does a couple things. One, it opens up this land south of Senate Street up to Pendleton Street for development for this purpose. And that was kind of a mix of stuff. But it really gives primacy to these existing state office buildings, the Calhoun State Office Building and the Wade Hampton State Office Building. Two buildings that, when they were constructed, were really expensive. And really, up until this point, the state's only two greatest investments in office space, office square footage, in its history. So by opening up Senate Street just to pedestrians, closing it to vehicular traffic, they're creating a kind of landscape around these buildings that invites them in to communicate with the State House. They're no longer just across the street from the State House. Now they're going to be part of the same landscape. Second, they dig a gigantic parking garage for more than 1,800 cars, 1,812 cars to be exact. This parking garage was 286,000 square feet, and it actually was never finished. It was supposed to be about a third larger. This was a $5.5 million hole in the ground. McNair, when he started this project, had enough trouble getting people behind him. But once people saw the scale of this hole, they really started to question, is he out of his mind? When this project was finished, and some of McNair's staffers were being interviewed about the process of construction by the local newspaper, one of them said when they started digging the big hole, his political opponents said that they were going to bury him in it. And he wasn't buried in it. And it still is an effective parking garage. One of the things I've always found really important about this parking garage is that it pushes all state employees underground in the moments in which they are accessing their offices. So you can park in this parking garage and access the State House via an underground escalator. You can access all of these buildings down here, which really kind of cuts down on the pedestrian traffic on the State House grounds itself, which is one of the reasons why it usually feels kind of empty. This parking garage also formed a platform, a very even, kind of dramatic on the south end by Pendleton Street. You can see that here, platform for new buildings. 3 new office buildings and the rehabilitation of an existing office building, and that's the Dennis building, which is here on the corner on Assembly Street. All three of these new buildings and this old building that was given a new outfit were designed by LBC&W in the brutalist architectural style. They're all covered in limestone panels and have steel frames. These buildings are not classical, but they are symmetrical, they are proportional, and they're all about the same height. They all match in color. And the intention here was to create a united front for these buildings. They all do the same thing. They're all office buildings for state legislators and state agencies, but this also gives them a kind of united front that differentiates them from the Calhoun and Wade Hampton state office buildings built in the 1920s and 1930s, right here, just adjacent, as well as the Capitol itself. They're all about the same height as the Calhoun and Hampton buildings, which is all in deference to the state capitol, which is far taller. So these buildings were designed to be sympathetic or even complementary to the state office buildings that already existed, including the State House. But by using this new style, LBC&W and McNair hoped also to project efficiency, maybe even frugality, and definitely strength. These are arguments for this new expanded state government built under McNair, just as much as the State House was an argument for slavery and the importance of South Carolina in opposition to the federal government in the 1860s. Style is absolutely part of that. But like most brutalist master plans, only a bit of this was ever finished, that central part right around the State House. And I bet LBC&W was somewhat disappointed, but most architects who worked in this period and devised these crazy, ambitious, basically budgetless plans, they knew that they weren't always going to get finished. And anybody who's ever pitched anything to the government knows that you ask for more than you know you're going to get. You're going to have to divide up the baby at some point. And so they only get this one extra block south of the State House. But this is still a really impressive group of buildings and a complete reimagining of the State House and its relationship to state government. So what happened? Why didn't people buy into this? Well, the gas crisis happened. It takes a really long time to build brutalist buildings. And a lot of legislators were really bratty about these buildings. They did not think that they were worth the money they were spending. They refused to occupy their own offices that had just been decorated for them. They continued to camp out in the State House that was totally a mess. Say, oh, I don't need that fancy office. There were all these newspaper articles saying, oh, guess how much so-and-so is spending on their office furniture, the chair for their receptionist. I mean, this was a big scandal. So by the time the last building was finished in 1981, there was really no interest in continuing this project beyond this one block. But still, we've come a really long way from wanting to fix a dirty parking lot around the Confederate monument. This was a really tremendous achievement. Doubled the size of the State House grounds, greatly increased the square footage available for the state government. Now, the past really wasn't the point of any of this. In fact, these buildings had the potential to show that the occupants of the State House, the principal occupants, legislators, were finally moving with the times. And after all, over the 1960s and 1970s, African Americans had become much more and demanded a much more powerful presence at the South Carolina State House. They began to protest at the State House for the first time in big numbers in the 1940s and 1950s, leading to even bigger rallies in the 60s and 70s. They protested segregation, the killing of Black men by state law enforcement in the Orangeburg Massacre. They protested for equal pay and voting rights. Their political acts activated the space of the State House grounds, this new, imagined, ripped up space. They activated that by protesting there in the same way that the Confederate women had activated the space by mourning the loss of their fathers and brothers and celebrated the lost cause. So this is a challenge to how this space is used, who this space is for, at the same time that it's literally getting ripped up and redistributed. In 1970, we also have the first Black legislators since Reconstruction that are elected to serve in the State House. So not only are Black South Carolinians begin to use and see the potential and take advantage of the potential available in the State House grounds, but they're also being elected to office to sit in this building as representatives of the people. So these new buildings and these wide plazas that are kind of almost empty seem to invite this kind of new representation. They weren't bogged down with monuments. They were of the latest styles of architecture. They spoke to right now. They spoke to South Carolina's potential in the future. But the past is still very much there in the Capitol complex of the 1970s and early 1980s. All the new buildings were named after very senior legislators. One of them, Edgar Brown, actually died the week after the building was one of the buildings was dedicated to them. And what was interesting to me in doing research about the naming of these buildings is that most of the people after whom these buildings were named had fought against Robert McNair for years for even building the buildings. They were fiscal conservatives that did not want these buildings to be constructed, and then they're named after them. Many of these legislators had fought very hard for the continuance of segregation. So they're fighting for the maintenance of that oppression that begins in the 19th century with slavery that's continued with Jim Crow segregation. So, for example, Edgar Brown said in 1959 that I declare that those forces outside of the South who advocate such legislation, integration legislation, are doing a terrible disservice to the well-being of all races and all people in South Carolina. We have insisted upon the maintenance of segregated public schools in South Carolina, and make no mistake about it, we will continue to insist upon segregated education in whatever form it must take. So quotes like that, which he spoke that at a House Judiciary Subcommittee on Civil Rights in 1959, really carried the mantle of that through line of history that we saw with the monuments on the 19th century State House grounds. So naming a building after him just continued that line past Tillman to the present. The one monument that was built as part of the Capitol complex was a monument to Jimmy Burns. And the statue was actually placed up in the corner, the northeast corner of the State House grounds across from Trinity Cathedral. They booted out the Confederate women for this one to take its place. And Jimmy Burns is one of the most decorated and certainly powerful legislators and politicians from South Carolina in the 20th century. And one of the things that he was most dedicated to was maintaining segregation. He ended his political career by returning to South Carolina to serve as governor and fight that fight. But of course, the monument to the past that remained consistent throughout this whole period of disruption in the Capitol complex is the Confederate flag. The Confederate flag goes on top of the State House in 1961, goes on top of the Dome in 1962, supposedly as part of the Civil War, celebration of the Civil War centennial, and then it just never comes down. In the decades that followed, South Carolinians' frustrations with the memories privileged on the State House grounds really center on the flag. The first protests were in the 1970s, led by the new legislators, the new Black legislators who were elected in 1970, 71. And then it waxed and waned over the years with lawsuits, boycotts, and outcry that finally reached a head in the 1990s with the NAACP's economic boycott of the state. So in 2000, the flag was removed from the Dome down to the Confederate monument. The argument was that it would be presented next to the Confederate monument on a flagpole as a relic, as part of the monument itself, rather than as a statement of where South Carolinians were in the present, as it would be if it sat above the dome. In reality, this brought it much closer to eyesight. It put it right on Gervais Street. And so many people argued that this was even worse than having it on the dome. The law passed on largely racial lines. This was a compromise, and this is really the first major compromise that I've seen in my research on the monuments on the State House grounds in 2000, because the alternative was to just take it down altogether. but that wouldn't have passed. So the compromise was to move it, to make it part of an existing monument. This movement, this compromise of the flag also came with a law. And this is a law that we're dealing with right now, and that's the Heritage Act. The Heritage Act was a law designed to prevent any further changes to the State House grounds. This was part of the compromise to basically stop the conversation. Okay, move the flag, we took it off the dome, conversation done. And this was in part based on frustration. People had been talking about the flag for decades. So this was an attempt to squelch that kind of discussion unless there was overwhelming support. In order for a monument on the State House grounds, specifically a war monument, to be altered, that there needs to be a 2/3 supermajority in the legislature. So we all know about this compromise, but this wasn't really the only compromise. I'd like to offer today 3 other monuments as part of this controversy and part of this compromise that ended with the flag. These were all monuments that had been in the works for a while, but were finally realized all at around the same time with some of the same people involved. And most importantly to me as an architectural and art historian, they look a lot alike. I think that is intentional here. The first is the African American History Monument, which is dedicated in 2001, but which had been under discussion since 1994. The second is the South Carolina Armed Forces Monument, which is on the exact same axis, just on the west side from the African American History Monument. It's dedicated in 2005. And interestingly enough, this monument is really the last vestige of a plan to build a whole, what was called a military commons, a series of flags around the Confederate monument, including the Confederate flag. So I think we got off pretty easy with the Armed Forces Monument. The third is the South Carolina Law Enforcement Memorial, which was dedicated in 2006, but which had been approved by the legislature in 1994. Each of these monuments is a circular plaza larger than any earlier monument on the grounds. Other than maybe the Sims Monument, no monument dictates the space around it and therefore the physical experience of looking at it like these monuments. But each was paid for with public funds except for the African American History Monument. The legislature that passed the African American History Monument that allowed for it to be built on the State House grounds specified that it must be built with private money. It was built entirely with private money. Some of that is corporate money, BMW, other companies donated to it, but the majority was donated by individuals. And no state money, no taxpayer money could go to it by law. The other 2 monuments were built almost entirely with state money. Now, of these 3 monuments, the African American monument is undoubtedly the most complicated. I'm going to try something here, try to take you on a little tour. So this is the most complicated of the monuments. It actually moves through space and time, beginning here in Africa with a depiction of a slave ship that is imprinted in terrazzo on the ground, to these representations of different kinds of rocks from the different kinds of places in West Africa from which slaves were kidnapped. Then we move to this semicircular series of sculptures that are relief sculptures. Some are a little bit higher in relief. This one is almost 3 dimensions than others, which are more flat. And in many ways, the beginning of this story, and this is a very chronological story that tells the history of South Carolina's African American population, the beginning of the story where they are enslaved here on the auction block, they're on the ships coming, passing the Middle Passage from Africa to North America. As they gain more control and autonomy, they begin to become more fully realized in terms of dimension. We move through time here and have this big break in the center of the monument, in the center of the narrative, showing emancipation. A giant obelisk sits in the middle, giving this monument height, giving it prominence on the landscape, also visually competing with the Confederate monument, and perhaps hearkening back to Africa. The obelisk is a form that began in Egypt. We pick up here on the other side of that break with Reconstruction. This panel here is the only representation or celebration of that Reconstruction era legislature on the State House grounds. The panel next to it represents segregation and Jim Crow, and it was explicit in the discussions by the Monument Committee that this not represent any form of violence, including the Klan or lynching. And we move to the present to generalized representations, although most Colombians can figure out who these people are, of the successes that African Americans have seen over the past 20, 30 years. Now, in this really good book that I recommend, Dell Upton's What Can and Can't Be Said, Dell argues that African American monuments, like this really amazingly complicated, complex, ambitious monument that Ed Dwight designed for us in South Carolina, that these monuments can only happen in public spaces as the result of compromise. And that's really what happened here. The African American monument was all wrapped up in the Confederate flag controversy, a monument that recognized the horrors of slavery could only happen if the flag were here to stay. And that's his argument in this book, which I think is dead on. But I want to extend it to these other monuments, this monument to state law enforcement, this monument to South Carolinian veterans. These are monuments that in many ways are representations of state power, paid for by the state. And they're erected at the same time as an African American monument, looking so very much like it. But there's one more piece to this. As soon as the new monuments were erected, a moratorium went in place. The very legislators who had argued for the flag, led by John Corson, declared that the State House grounds were full. They said that it was starting to look like a theme park. So they built the two biggest monuments, other than the African American monument, that had ever been made on the State House grounds. And then they say that there's too many monuments. And they passed this moratorium in 2007 that I really think you have to think of as being next to the Heritage Act. It's a kind of a twin piece of legislation. And what this does is it says that there really needs to be a supermajority within committee in order to add any more monuments. What this does for the already really ambitious African American monument is that it has to be the final word for pretty much all African American history on the State House grounds. It's going to be really hard with this moratorium to add a new monument. Now, the Heritage Act is in the news a lot these days. Last week, State Attorney General Alan Wilson asked the South Carolina Supreme Court to take up a lawsuit that challenges the constitutionality of the Heritage Act. It argues, this lawsuit argues that the supermajority required to make a decision on monuments is unconstitutional, that you should need a regular majority. Why do you need a supermajority for this issue? It also says that the Heritage Act it improperly takes over powers of local and city and county governments that have their own monuments. That those are something that they should be able to deal with without having to ask the state for permission. And that would extend to universities like USC or Clemson that want to change the names of buildings. But the moratorium should also be considered as part of this discussion with the Heritage Act, because it really asks the question, okay, once you start taking monuments down, what's next? The monuments on the State House grounds were almost all erected under the power of just a handful of people. The one exception is really the African American History Monument. And its form reflects that. It's complicated, layers, it has lots of pieces. There were lots of things that people didn't get that they wanted to be represented in that monument, such as a lynching, such as Denmark Vesey, who led a slave rebellion in the 19th century. But maybe that's how a monument should be in a democracy. Changing, unsatisfying, constantly prompting more discussion, reevaluation. Monuments are starting points for discussion, starting points for investigation of history. They are not history in themselves. But I hope that I have given you a sense of how important their histories are. When we look at the history of monuments, they tell us a heck of a lot more about the people who put them up than they do about the things that they represent. And by keeping these monuments in places of honor, they say a lot about us. And so that's the question I think we need to ask. So I'm glad to answer your questions. I hope I can answer your questions. Thank you.
I'm clapping for everyone.
Well, I can see some of your faces. This is not a particularly satisfying, just, it's not, it doesn't feel like dialogue. I'll say that.
A couple of questions to get you started, and I hope others will chime in. Why was no state money used for the African American monument?
That was part of the law, and I haven't been able to find exactly why that happened. A lot of those discussions, I have not read if there is documentation of them. But it wasn't part of it. And actually, Mark Sanford, who was governor at the time that the law enforcement monument was finally getting funded, he vetoed the law that funded the law enforcement monument initially, and he got such bad press for it that he had to go back and say that I think it cost $250,000. But he didn't want state money to go for that either. So it's more complicated than just, people wanted African American monument, thought it should be paid for the state, and people who didn't want the state to pay for it. It was a lot more complicated and political than that, and part of fiscal conservatives' arguments as well.
Are there any accounts of cars hitting the Confederate monument, and did that play into the discussions about the parking lot surrounding it?
I love cars hitting monuments. No, I don't. I haven't seen any of those. I think the parking lot was pretty organized. Let me get you a picture of it. The parking lot was actually pretty organized. And legislators were most of the people who were parking there. There were so many great discussions in the newspaper when they were closing Senate Street in the 60s about where state legislators were complaining that they were going to have to walk after they parked their car. The one problem that they really had with people hitting monuments with cars was with the Confederate Women Monument, which was basically sitting in Senate Street behind the State House on the south side in the 30s. And that's why they moved it up to where the Burns Monument was. So it was sitting here, and then they moved it here in the 30s, and then it gets shoved back up here when the Jimmy Burns Monument comes into play. So that one did get beat up by cars. I love trivia questions.
Has a Native American history monument ever been considered per your research?
I haven't seen discussions of that. If somebody knows of that, I would love to know more about that. That'd be really interesting. But I haven't found that.
How did the Capitol complex plan fit into the larger, Doxiadis plan?
Doxiadis. Oh, I know the person who answered. I don't know who it is, but I know this person, I'm sure. So LBCNW and Wilbur Smith and Associates were also working on a master plan for Columbia that was tremendously ambitious, even more ambitious than this thing. They had imagined, and actually the Capitol complex was part of it, to answer your question. They imagined that the Capitol complex would be the south anchor for this giant pedestrian mall that would go up Main Street. So they'd wipe out all cars on Main Street. and end with another huge complex for the city government and the county government up where the Richland County Courthouse is now. The Richland County Courthouse is really the only piece that's ever built. But they imagined that whole street would be pedestrian, and horrors of horrors, they wanted to tear down all the buildings on Main Street, including all the really sweet 19th century buildings that Historic Columbia has worked so hard to save and hold easements on. They were going to tear all of that down and replace them with buildings that look like this. So next time you're on the State House grounds and you say, oh, these buildings are ugly, you could have gotten a lot more of this. And they're not ugly. You just need to consider them in their context. But the idea was to create this giant kind of organized, logical, rational, modern look and feel for Columbia. They also imagined a big people mover system, kind of a monorail that would have moved everybody from a giant parking facility on Assembly Street around like the Chicago Loop around Main Street. So they didn't get much of that, and I'm not really that sad about it.
How was Strom Thurmond's monument financed?
So Strom Thurmond's monument was financed privately. So both Strom Thurmond and Jimmy Burns, and I skipped Strom Thurmond because I figured most of you guys knew that story. But Strom, let me find the picture of Mr. Burns. Strom and the Jimmy Burns monument, both of those legislators specified, because both of those monuments were built and designed while those men were living. They specified that no public monies would be used in their monuments. And so Jimmy Burns's monument was actually raised by his foundation, but also by individuals gave money. Strom Thurmond's was much more corporate in terms of who donated. So most of the donations were made by a handful of corporate donors, and their names were all written on the bottom of the monument. So next time you can see who paid for that one. Whereas the Jimmy Burns monument does not have any names on it. Although I do think there is a time capsule in the ground at the base that includes a list of all the names. We're not going to go digging for it. I really like the paving around this. I don't want it to get messed up. Best part.
Ann Cox, if you will type your question into the chat box, we can answer it from there. So while we'll give Ann a minute to do that. Does the statue being privately funded change its protection status under the Heritage Act?
No. Once it's on state property, it's owned by the state. And the same goes for most of the monuments on the National Mall in Washington were paid for by private money. So the Vietnam Veterans Monument, for example, the beautiful minimalist black glass wall, that was all paid for by private money. So this model is pretty normal. And in fact, most of the monuments on the State House grounds were paid for with a mix. So for example, the Wade Hampton Monument, the legislation that appropriated money for the Wade Hampton Monument in 1904 specified that the state would only give up the cash for the monument once an equal amount had been raised, $10,000 had been raised privately, but that money never came privately and people wanted the monument, so the state ended up paying for the whole thing. And I actually saw that happening again and again with the monuments. The same thing happened for the Sims Monument. They were only able to raise like $3,500 or something privately. So most of that monument was paid for with public money, in part because once the state government says they're going to do something, people expect them to do it. And so there becomes a conflict there.
Lydia, we are right at 1 o'clock, so I want to be respectful of your time and our participants. I want to thank you again for working with us on this series and being willing to present all your extraordinary research to members of Historic Columbia and interested parties in the community. Also, again, want to just note South Carolina Humanities and Richland County Conservation Commission, who made this possible from our standpoint. We have, just so folks know, we have submitted a grant to South Carolina Humanities to have Lydia do a podcast that would allow people to walk the State House grounds and learn more about the site. So if you're interested in that, I'd be happy to follow up to increase the support around that project down the road. But thank you again, Lydia, for everything thus far, and we look forward to a continued partnership. And thanks everybody for being with us today.
Thanks, everyone.